everybody. Thanks for coming over to Crafts and Crime. I'm Chantal, and this is episode 2. We're going to continue on with the second half of the Robert Lee Bennett Jr. case, and we're also going to be working on this hideous thing that I found at Goodwill about a month ago. I'm really lucky. I have 2 excellent Goodwill stores near me. The closest one is a gold mine for designer clothes. I found 2 brand new Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren dresses in there for like $14. Now, they're usually really, really tiny, and I can't even squeeze like one boob into them, let alone my entire body. But sometimes I get really lucky and I can find something in my size. I'm the kind of person who really, really likes to dig through the racks. So I found a lot of stuff at Goodwill. And I swear, most of the stuff in there has never even been worn. I found so many party dresses, but the thing is, I never actually go anywhere, partly because this pandemic will never end, and partly because in the before times, I was a massive recluse. So because of that, all these pretty clothes just hang in my closet, and I just stand there looking at them, pretending I'm not an introvert with nowhere to go. So I picked up this clipboard in a frame. It is pretty fantastic farmhouse chic. I thought it needed to be really cleaned well, but I wiped it down and I realized it was just painted to look really, really distressed. So I think it needs to be painted with brighter colors and just make it look overall happier because it looks pretty sad, and add some fun touches to it. In other news, my son suggested that I make this channel about crime, crafts, and cats. He said that it's really good for the YouTube algorithm because people who watch YouTube always like cats. Cats do super well on YouTube. Now, I know he's smart. He's 11. He's a really clever kid. And I think he might be onto something. So here you go. Cat. 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 These are my cats, Coconut and Hazelnut. We always name our cats after food. It's a thing. I don't know why. I don't have a good explanation. They're rag dolls, and we love them. That sounded really perverted. I'm sorry. I don't know. We love them an appropriate amount, I promise. Okay, let me give a quick recap of where we left off last week. I was telling you about a super wonderful guy named Robert Lee Bennett Jr. He was a stellar husband who worked really hard as a lawyer and made his wife so proud. Oh, wait, no, that's not accurate at all. He married his secretary despite, I'm pretty sure he was gay. I mean, he didn't admit it or anything, but I think we can all agree he was gay. And then after they got married, he immediately quit his job as a lawyer to go be a mall jewelry salesman. I'm sure his in-laws loved that life path for him. I wonder if they want to play Find the Idiot with us. At the end of last week's episode, Bennett was picking up men, drugging them, and burning them. He had been in and out of trouble with the police for 20 years for various offenses, but had always managed to land on his feet because having an influential daddy can do that for you. He'd also been drugging men and setting them on fire for 20 years too, but he hadn't been caught for that, although the whisper network among the gay scene was catching on. But now it was 1991, and, well, he might be landing in a steaming pile. Gary Clapp, the straight man who had lost his fiancée when his legs were amputated due to his injuries, he had spoken to the police, and he had immediately identified Bennett as his attacker. Michael Jordan Jr., who had been left behind a hotel by Bennett, he'd also spoken to the cops, as did Max Schrader. Both had identified Bennett. Things were closing in on him. As it turned out, nothing happened. The police took the reports and then basically told the guys, "Okay, thanks. We'll get back to you." And then, put the reports in a drawer and went back to doing other stuff. I'm going to assume the other stuff was watching the Jeffrey Dahmer case unfold in Milwaukee. Yep, that whole mess was happening at around the same time. I know what you're thinking. Gay men, torture, There aren't any parallels in these cases, so why on earth should they be taking any of this seriously? I know, right? These cops felt the exact same way. They just didn't see any parallels either. They just ignored all these interviews they had just done and Starsky and Hutched all over downtown Atlanta doing other stuff instead. Are you depressed yet? Yeah, me too. Here, have a cat. You know who I bet loved cats? This reporter named Richard Greer, who worked for the newspaper, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Now, to be fair, I have no idea if he liked cats or dogs or any animals, but I'm getting the vibe that he did. I'm getting the vibe he was overall awesome, because as it turns out, he'd been following along with the handcuffed man assaults for a while. Richard Greer, who for some dumb reason I keep wanting to call Richard Grieco. Apparently I'm imagining this whole thing as like a really dark 21 Jump Street episode. It was not Richard Grieco, people. That's somebody else entirely. It's Richard Greer. Richard Greer. So, okay, Richard Greer, the reporter, he had written an article about a guy who had been burned and beaten after drinking vodka laced with drugs, and his story got rejected by his paper. Informants kept calling him, though. All these hustlers would call him up and tell him about some dumb jackass creepster they knew called the Handcuff Man. I think at this point the sex workers, they were just fed up by then and were like, if we keep phoning in tips, somebody has to do something, right? Then a bartender told Greer about attacks going back as far as 1968. At that point, the attacks had been going on for close to 20 years. I'm sure when Greer heard that, he asked for some water so he could say, "Shut the fuck up." Armed with this information, Greer, not Grieco, went to detectives and they admitted, and I'm quoting from Greer's future article here, quote, "mostly off the record," unquote, that the handcuffed man was very real and, quote, "they had no idea why there wasn't an active investigation," unquote. I don't think homophobia could possibly be a factor here. What do you think? Then Greer got a tip about a cop who was moonlighting as a security guard at a gay bar. That officer gave Greer a name, and Greer had the final piece. Finally, enough facts to put together a concrete story that the cops had a suspect for all these assaults and had tried to gather evidence against him, but they just didn't pursue it. Now, the paper could have gone ahead and run the story without thinking really hard about it. I mean, they had all this information, they had all these tips, and they had basically all this, well, not evidence, but like all of these informants. But was that really the responsible thing to do? I mean, after all, the suspect, Bennett, he hadn't been charged with anything. He was just a member of the public, essentially just a rando. So the staff at the newspaper, they decided to talk about it. And they talked about it. And then they talked about it some more. According to Greer, the staff at the paper considered naming him in this newly written article, but after much consideration, they decided not to, and they actually deleted some information that would identify him. So all this fussing about and poking around by a newspaper reported, it must have freaked out the police. Because while the newspaper staff and Greer agonized over this decision to name him in the article, and the word agonize was Greer's word, so I do actually believe that it was a tough decision for them, and one that they didn't take lightly. So while they were like sitting there and agonizing over this decision, the police held a press conference. So I think they knew that an article was going to come out about the attacks, and they thought, wow, we're going to look like a bunch of noobs if we don't come out ahead of this and say, yeah, we're launching an investigation and, we're taking it seriously and we're awesome at detecting because we have detectives that detect bad guys. And, Yes, I know I said noobs. I know. Tell me you have a preteen without telling me you have a preteen. I can't help myself. Greer spent some time looking at court records, and that's when he found out about Bennett kidnapping the undercover cop. He found out Bennett's ex-wife, her attorney, and the brave guys I mentioned in the last episode all came forward during his divorce trial to accuse him of being the handcuffed man. He also found out about the 1982 murder case against Bennett, where he was charged but not convicted. He figured, okay, that's enough evidence to name him in my next news article. Again, he had a debate with the staff at the paper, and again the editors decided, no, that information is really good, but it's not current enough. The newspaper guys held off on naming Bennett again. It's frustrating, isn't it? From a public safety perspective, it's easy to go, oh, come on. This guy is a sadistic weenie bag. Let's put him on blast and let people know to keep away from him already. But there's journalistic integrity and journalistic tradition, and it was also just a different time. There wasn't the internet back then where rumors spread from country to country in like 15 minutes or less. There was a way of doing things, and you just couldn't break the rules. Then Greer found out that Bennett's most recent victim identified him in a police photo lineup, and that's when things changed. His editors had wanted something current to link him to the crimes, and well, that was it. The only thing standing in their way was the journalistic tradition to not name suspects. So they had a conversation again, and finally they just said screw it. Even though some people working at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the paper, including Greer himself, they still had doubts if they were doing absolutely the right thing. In the end, they just decided to go public with Bennett's name. So, woo-woo! In Greer's article from 1991, which I'm going to link below, he says that in retrospect, he has no doubt that it was the right thing to do. The prime concern should have been, now he says this more nicely than I do, should have been to just slap the stupid out of the police force and get them to move on with the investigation in the first place, rather than let them continue to let the attacks slide. Once the article came out, Bennett hung his head in shame, admitted his wrongdoings, and begged for forgiveness. Yeah, no, none of that happened. He denied being the handcuffed man, saying that a detective in Atlanta, he just wanted to solve the case and he became fixated on him, and it was just a simple case of mistaken identity, and why was everybody being so mean to him? Oh, stop being so mean. I mean, you gotta give it to him for originality. First, he married his secretary. Then he came up with this truly unique, one-of-a-kind defense. I mean, wow. Where does he get this stuff? Bennett hired himself a lawyer named Guy Naughty. Now, I'm not sure how to actually say his name. It's spelled Notte. So it could be not, but I'm going to say Naughty because, let's face it, it's just more fun to call him Naughty. When he got arrested, his lawyer, Naughty, came up with a very realistic explanation for what happened in regards to the Florida victim, Gary Clapp. If you remember, Gary Clapp was the man who was burned so badly his legs had to be removed. So Naughty's explanation was that Clapp obviously was the victim of witchcraft. Witchcraft is definitely involved in this, Naughty said. Because near Clapp's body there had been, quote, decapitated chickens, decapitated goats, which smacks of the cult Santeria, unquote. It smacks of Santeria. Smacks of it. You know who needs a smack on the head? Naughty. Or maybe he's just doing smack. Because this explanation, it blows. Maybe he was doing blow? Is blow the same as smack? I'm just a boring housewife. I don't know this stuff. I don't know. But I know this rationale sucks. I'd like to put a disclaimer here and say that I have no proof that anybody was doing any drugs or dealing any drugs or inhaling any drugs. Please don't sue me. You know what else sucked? The fact that Naughty requested a change of venue for the trial. I get it. I mean, it's the way that the judicial system works. You have money, you can afford a decent defense lawyer, and that decent defense lawyer is going to try a move like this on the grounds that the intensity of publicity surrounding this case has severely prejudiced potential jurors. Well, you know what? It didn't work. Not at all. They still had to do the case there. At this point, Bennett also got arrested for a charge against Gary Clapp in Florida. While he was in the courtroom trying to waive extradition to Florida, Bennett whined about the conditions in prison. He said sometimes he didn't get breakfast. Sometimes he had to go 5 whole hours without his blankie. Sometimes he didn't get a pillow, and sometimes he didn't get cigarettes. He said the other prisoners were scary. They threatened him. And one guy, he said that he'd cut Bennett. He'd cut him. For real. It's so scary. Oh, God, what a whiner. I mean, I don't know about you, but this is quite a difference from the country club picture I had of prison life. Wow. I had no idea that's what could happen in prison. This guy sucks. So Gary Clapp was deposed before the Florida trial began. The deposition occurred at the DA's office, and in the room were Clapp, the district attorney, the prosecutor, and a court reporter. Also present were Guy Naughty and Robert Bennett. Man, as if Gary Clapp hadn't been through enough, he had to go through the stress of the deposition with his attacker in the same freaking room with them. Unbelievable. Like, this crap is ridiculous. During the deposition, the stump of one of Clapp's legs began to bleed. You have to realize this was only about a year after the attack had taken place. Clapp was still healing. This was a lot of trauma to take place in a pretty compressed timeline when you really think about it. And I'm sure the anxiety of the situation didn't help. I know anxiety can really mess you up, so I'm sure it played a part in how his body was responding. As I was reading through this whole thing the first time, I was like, my God, what else does this poor man have to go through? So as this happened, Bennett's lawyer, Naughty, noticed the bleeding, and he turned to Gary Clapp, and as a normal human would do, and he asked him if he was okay, if he needed some medical attention, and if he wanted to delay the deposition. That basic display of human decency really freaking pissed Bennett off. Later on, when interviewed, Naughty actually admitted that Bennett was the coldest, most remorseless client he had ever worked with. Yeah, dude, I hear that. That is not surprising. Let me tell you what I'm doing here real quick. These are tiny fruit slices made out of polymer clay that I bought off Amazon. And I'm gluing them down. Okay, back to the story. So when all these charges initially went down, Bennett was determined to fight in court. He burned through like $500,000 preparing his defense. I guess his short time working at Kay's Jewelers or whatever really did pay off. Or, it was probably his daddy's juicy inheritance. Whatever it was, Bennett really thought about what his trial would be like. Good-looking guy after good-looking guy, marching through the courthouse and pointing a finger directly at him, accusing him of just horrible atrocities. And he knew that in the Tampa, Florida case with Gary Clapp, the fire department actually had a video of Clapp burning. That alone sounds sadistic in and of itself, until you realize that when they were filming it, they didn't realize that there was actually a person under that blaze. Ultimately, Bennett was a coward. He couldn't stand the thought of having to face what he did. And he knew that if found guilty in court, a life sentence in Florida meant an actual life sentence. So he told Naughty to ask for a plea bargain. He paid $300,000 in bail, got out of prison, spent some time with his mom, and the lawyers worked out the bargain. A grand negotiation took place between Naughty and the prosecutors. It took some doing, but they finally agreed that Bennett would plead guilty to the attempted murder of Gary Clapp and 2 counts, only 2 counts, of aggravated assault in Atlanta. I will admit that charges and sentencing and whatnot is not really my forte, but that doesn't sound right to me. To add insult to hot burning injury, literally, he was given a 17-year sentence for the attempted murder charge to run concurrently with his sentence for the Atlanta crimes. That means that instead of serving his sentences back to back, which is called a consecutive sentence, he could mash up his sentences into the same time frame and serve them both at once. That sounds like a piece of poop cake with mashed potato frosting. Not awesome, people. Not awesome. We need some kittens. Dear God, we need some kittens. Give us all the kittens because this is a freaking disaster. You know, here we are looking back on this in the year of our Savior, Beyonce 2021. And I think it's quite normal to say, all hail the gays loud and proud and not think anything of it, and thank God for that. But back in the early 90s when I was a teenager, it wasn't like that. I'm reading these articles and I'm thinking, man, what in the holy bejesus is going on here? These cops aren't investigating a deranged sadist. These judges are doing a crap job giving out decent sentences. And who is calling them out on their crap? I'll tell you who. The gay activists, that's who. That's right, they were having none of it and good for them. Larry Pellegrini, he was the president of the Lesbian and Gay Rights Chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. Man, that's a mouthful. It took me like 4 tries to get that right. I had to edit it out. I mean, you have to be really dedicated to the cause just to answer the phone. Hello, you have reached the Lesbian and Gay Rights Chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. How may I direct your call? Anyway, Larry Pellegrini was the president, and he totally called these people out on their horse duty sentence. Good citizens need to step forward, he said. This is horrendous. Damn straight it's horrendous. Jeez. I'm going to pour resin over this. The polymer clay sprinkles stick up, so a layer of resin will make the surface smooth. Resin has 2 parts, and you have to measure them out equally and mix, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to read directly from the Murderpedia article here because there's really nothing else that I can say here except the direct quotes from these rock star advocates. Lynn Cothran, co-chair of Queer Nation, said, "It's a sad situation when people can get away with torture, intimidation, and hate. There's obviously a problem with the system." The Atlanta president of Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, Judy Kolbs, remarked, "Setting people on fire is setting people on fire, and it should not matter what the sexual orientation is. It goes back to prejudice. It affects and invades all parts of society." Okay, I'm going to interject into the article here, but for fuck's sake, if we have to point out that setting people on fire is setting people on fire and that's a bad thing, then what in the... I mean, I don't know how to tell people that someone's sexual orientation should not be a factor when it comes to not using them as kindling. For crying out loud. Okay, back to the article. Jeff Graham, a member of ACT UP, an AIDS activist organization, also decried the plea bargain. "I think clearly if it were a case involving heterosexuals, that if he had done this to a woman or a straight man, that his sentence would be much greater than it is," Graham speculated. "It has taken the Atlanta Police Department dozens of years to seriously investigate and solve this case. I think that clearly you've got a prejudiced judicial system in Atlanta, in Fulton County. I'm happy Tampa was able to put together the case. Ooh, burn, Atlanta. Graham totally burned you. He's happy Tampa got their ish together. Then the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, that newspaper that Greer worked for, they got in on it too, and they published an editorial titled Reject Handcuff Case Deal. Yeah, you know what? Nobody thought this sentence was good. So you guys remember Max Schrader, right? He was one of Bennett's many victims from the last episode. He went to the police and he picked him out of a photo lineup and everything. He said the prosecutors never even contacted him to discuss the plea deal. That smacks of disrespect. But you know, those prosecutors did work that deal out with Naughty, and as we discussed earlier, Naughty seems to have issues with smack and blow and headless chickens and Santeria and whatever. Again, don't sue me. But this whole thing is exceptionally disrespectful, and it's just crappy, and I don't have a problem saying that. Despite everybody's objections, the deal went through. It's total crap. I'm not impressed, but nobody asked me, and I'm sure you're all very shocked by that. I know I am. Bennett had to serve 17 years in prison to run concurrently with the 17 years he got for the attempted murder of Gary Clapp. So basically, yeah, you pled guilty for this, but it's like it doesn't matter because you're already going to be in prison for doing this other horrible thing. So, yeah, okay, whatever. Why don't we just make you pay an extra $65,000 in restitution for the victim's medical bills, tell you never to come back here, go see a shrink, and call it a day? Sounds good. See ya. Absolutely ridiculous. Initially, Bennett was placed into solitary confinement for his own safety, but then he was released into general population after like 2 weeks, and then he just continued to be a douche. They say he was an average inmate and hadn't caused any problems. But I mean, we all know he continued to be a douche because a douchebag never really changes his... You know what? I'm not going to continue with that metaphor. When going over cases like this, people always want to know the why. Why would this Furby disguised as a human be motivated to act like this? The quick answer was that he was a gay basher. That might be true. Eventually, Bennett admitted to being gay himself. I mean, yeah, duh. So the idea at the time was that he was going after sex workers. He hated the idea of selling sex. Hurting Gary Clapp, who wasn't gay and wasn't a sex worker, I guess that had been a mistake? Now, I actually don't think either of those assessments about Bennett are quite right. After reading about this case, I wonder if there was some serious self-loathing going on. Like, I'm gay and I hate this about myself, so I'm going to take this out on you kind of reasoning. Okay, the resin is poured, but it gets bubbles in it as you're pouring and as you're mixing it. So I'm using a torch to blast the bubbles out. Then I need to cover it so dust doesn't get in it, and I set it aside to let it cure. I let it sit for about 24 hours, and when I come back, it's hardened. I think sometimes we're looking for these explanations that are cut and dry and completely make sense, but emotions, especially complex ones regarding sexuality and self-esteem, and especially when they're wrapped up in personality disorders, you can't really pick through them and make them make sense. The fact that he suffered from chronic impotence, that was probably also a factor in his crimes. I'm thinking he was probably jealous. There was this jealousy plus a hatred of this thing that other men could do. It's not like in the late 60s when he started committing these crimes, Viagra existed, or there were bus ads about erectile dysfunction. People were very hush-hush about these things. I don't know, what do you guys think made him commit these crimes? I never have anybody to talk to about this stuff, so I'd actually really like to know what you think. Let me know in the comments. I'm interested in knowing your opinions. Only one time during Bennett's incarceration did he ever get in trouble. He got a write-up for disorderly conduct. Now, I have no idea what that write-up actually entails. He did try to file a lawsuit against his lawyer Naughty for ineffective assistance of counsel because he's a sore loser crybaby. The suit was still pending when Bennett had a stroke and died. He died on April Fool's Day, 1998. And that, my friends, is the story of Robert Lee Bennett Jr. Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed today's craft. If you did, please hit the subscribe button. It really does help me get into the YouTube algorithm. I'll see everybody next week.